Our guest today is the CEO and co founder of Vanta, Christina Cacioppo. Vanta is a unicorn in the security compliance space, helping companies become SOC 2 compliant as an example. They have over 3,000 customers and were recently valued at $1.6 billion. Christina, I'm so excited to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's go back all the way to 2017 and tell us why you started Vanta. What was the original insight and why did you decide to become a founder?
Yeah, so two parts. So Vanta specifically, so to take you and listeners back to 2017. So this was the 2016 election in the US had just happened where everyone's emails were everywhere and everyone was being hacked. There were a bunch of high profile data breaches, Equifax, Uber, Sony, Target. And it was clear that security on the internet was one, just really important. And two, it seemed like we were not very good at it. And the original puzzle was just why that was. Because again, if something's important, assumedly we're concentrating on it, getting better at it. And yes, it's hard, but again, I think actually quite optimistic about people figuring things out in general, and we tend to figure them out. And so what was happening there? I think the other puzzle, just as I learned more about Equifax and Uber and the Democrats in 2016, and you learn about these breaches and they seem to happen for kind of silly reasons, right? Someone doesn't have two-factor in their email. Someone leaves a cloud storage bucket open to the world. And again, but there's very smart, motivated people working on these things. Why are they like leaving the front door open? And it started as this puzzle to go figure that out. Where you're like, I don't know if I'll find anything interesting at the end of this, but it's a neat detective exercise, and found a couple things out. One, this stuff is really hard and it looks easy because you could be like, oh, you just didn't put 2FA on, you left your front door open, like silly you. And stuff like that is hard because it's not like there's one front door, right? To like torture that analogy. It's like any company has any number of front doors and windows in their security that they can leave open, and there's a lot of these and they change all the time, right? If you think about a cloud infrastructure account, it's just like constantly changing. And so it's actually really hard to keep track of and do. And then it's just hard. And then you have people on the other side and processes, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And just like the problem actually on the surface seeming very simple, actually being quite hard. The other piece was incentives. I studied economics in school, and so really like thinking about incentives. And in another life, I think I would have been a microeconomics professor. But one of the things we found, especially when talking to startups and quickly growing companies, is the founders totally knew they should take security seriously and very much wanted to, from a normative sense, from a business sense, both running up into two problems. One was they often didn't quite know what to do. What does it mean to have good security as a seed A, B stage startup? The second bit was, even if you knew, that also required a bunch of work, right? And that work got prioritized against things like finding product market fit, growing revenue, retaining customers. And while security was objectively very important, it was really hard to trade that off against building a feature to save your biggest customer, right? Or pushing your roadmap forward so you can earn more business. And so security got caught in this gap where founders wanted to take it seriously, knew they should, but couldn't, from a business perspective, feel like they could justify prioritizing it. And so that was the milieu that Vanta came out of.
Got it. And you were at Dropbox at the time.
So I was at Dropbox earlier, and actually you asked about becoming a founder. And so that story actually starts much earlier. I think even back in undergrad, I wanted to start a company, but I did not admit that to anyone else. I didn't really even admit it to myself. And I think I had a lot of people like me, for whatever definition. I didn't study computer science. I grew up in the Midwest, whatever. I don't start companies, right? If you want to start a company, you should have been building stuff in your bedroom when you were like 7 years old. And shoot, now I'm too late. My time has passed.
Too late. 20. Oh my.
The hubris and the depression of a 20-year-old. But I'm joking. But what was really transformative for me was right out of school, I was lucky enough to work at an early stage venture firm, Union Square Ventures, USV in New York. And my job there was basically just to meet with founders all day long for 2 years straight. And so just met with dozens and dozens of founders and realized all sorts of people start companies. And like and yes, there's some common traits. You gotta want to like get stuff done and run through walls a little bit, but also there's like a million differences, and it's about figuring out what it was like. And so that I actually found, and it was like a light bulb moment, but just over time, again, seeing people who were successful, who I thought I shared qualities to. So it wasn't just people that I didn't feel like. The one kind of chip I still had on my shoulder was I was not technical and I wanted to start a software company. And lots of non-technical people start software companies, but I, to a fault, am a like, I need to figure out to have confidence in it person. I'm not a fake it till you make it person. I wish I were more. But so what I did was I took my bonus 1 year and extended it over 2.5 years, and just taught myself to code and built a bunch of products, none of which anyone has ever heard of because they didn't really go anywhere, but just had this. In retro, it was fun at the time. It was also stressful at this time, but this period of just learning how to build and to make and do that for the first time. And I think some of that was just really helpful in convincing me I was someone who could learn how to do things and learn how to make things, and sufficiently technical to make shoddy MVPs, right? Like I could not get hired as an engineer at Vanta today, or probably at any point in our history, but realizing I really liked being able to like prototype my ideas, and that was really important to me, and a confidence building and a testing and iteration perspective. And so just doing that for a couple of years was probably the like last piece of the puzzle.
Makes sense. So the big focus of our show is finding product market fit, and we typically divide that up into two broad stages, which already sounds very simple. No, it's not. It's definitely very cyclical, but for the sake of simplicity in the narrative, phase one, like test how strong and differentiated the product value hypothesis is. Is this really unique? Is it compelling? Does it really solve a problem with a lot of like tailwinds behind it? And second, who for, right? Who is the desperate customer who can validate the growth hypothesis of like how this company will find momentum and take off? So that's how we usually divide it up. How did you think about this path of product market fit, especially having been in venture before, seeing a lot of founders struggle through it? Was that a benefit or an advantage to have gone through that experience? And how did you approach like this journey of product market fit? What was it like?
Yeah, so I think it was probably a benefit, although it made me probably a little too considered. So by that, having worked in venture and early stage venture, you see how, I think as an industry, we celebrate raising money. But when you're like working in venture, you're like, oh, that's not the thing, right? The thing is getting customers and happy customers and retaining them. And how when you've raised a bunch of money but don't have growth in customers, or don't, and then lose conviction yourself, that is just like the worst, because there's this huge gap between, right, like the money and I should be successful and we should be growing, and oh shoot, we're not. Like there isn't product market fit. And so realizing it's never fun to not have product market fit, but it is in fact worse to not have it with $4 million in your bank account than $0 in your bank account. And so there's that piece of raising money is fine, but it doesn't solve the product market fit problem. And that is in fact a very real problem. Anyway, so super skeptical on that. Also in my 2 years of building things, I mentioned this, but I built a bunch of stuff no one wanted. And it's fun when you're learning and you're like, oh, I got better at coding, or I like learned this new skill or whatever. But fundamentally, when no one wants your stuff, that just isn't fun either. And had a bunch of prior experience and kind of failure by many senses of the term that made me really stringent about product market fit for Vanta or for a startup. And so I can talk through the process, but what it looked like was basically a 6-month process that started with really open-ended questions, moved to spreadsheet prototypes, and then moved to prototypes that we told people were generated with code, that were written by hand. And then at the end of the 6 months started coding, and it was because we realized we could build kind of whatever thing we wanted, but that didn't mean people wanted it, right? And so just front loaded all of this exploration and testing and iteration so that when we did start writing code, hopefully it was like the right code toward a problem that was actually real and resonant and folks would pay for with their time and money.
And so could you share a few examples from that time, maybe ideas you had confidence in that didn't go anywhere? And then
Yeah.
how would you articulate the first problem you decided, yes, this is worth building the product around, this one problem we'll focus on?
For sure. Going back to like security being interesting and it's really important, but we're not very good at it. What's going on? So the first version of this, I alluded to it, was again talking to startup founders, and a good portion of them were like, hey, I know security is important, but what does that mean for a seed stage company or a Series A company? And so what we did was went and talked to a bunch of security experts and figured out a version of that, and then made this like prescriptive checklist of here's what good security means and here's what you do. And we went and handed that to a bunch of CTOs who said, thank you so much. This is so great. We love it. And they're like, oh, excellent. Maybe we should start coding. And then go back a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, and be like, where are you on the checklist? And they're like, oh, I haven't started. And you're like, why not? And they're like, oh, because I want to, I should, but here's the 9 million other priorities that are more business pressing that have come up.
Right.
And then we're like, oh, what if I started doing this for you? Can I come in and do it for you? And they'd be like, they might say yes, but they mostly were like, ooh, well, we got to get you set up. I have to spend a bunch of time getting you set up, and I've got to invest a bunch of time in setting you up to do that. And I don't want to spend the time. Love you, but don't want. Right? And so you're like, ooh, this is not going so well. So that was one version. Another version, as we started poking around and just having more conversations, we came across security questionnaires, right? And it was this moment when a company, a B2B company, is selling to probably a bigger company, and the big company is like, hey, maybe I like your product, but you're this couple people in a garage, like, how can I trust you? Can you go answer all these questions for me? Sometimes I called them up, sometimes I send a spreadsheet. And we're like, okay, this is interesting. So what we started doing was like taking those calls on behalf of companies, and so just being like, can we do it? Are we credible? We started answering security questionnaires again by hand for people, and that worked better, except what we realized was it was all, and we build some tech, but like we weren't actually super convinced we could standardize this. And it's interesting, there's more companies now that answer security questionnaires for companies, Vanta partners with a couple of them, but it tends to be partially tech, partially services. And so that was our thesis at the time. And we realized, hey, maybe it's going to change, but it's a technology bet, and you're not betting on your tech, you're like betting on Google to make better NLP tech. Anyway, and it just felt, oh, your destiny is in the hands of like Google's NLP API, and that doesn't feel great. Anyway, so then we're like, okay, no one likes these questionnaires. How do you get rid of the questionnaires? Kind of ask around about that, and we came across compliance certifications. So then it was like, ooh, I remember these. I ran into one at Dropbox. It was terrible. I like ran like the other direction because it was so bad, basically. What are these compliance certifications? And so start poking around, and then we start preparing companies for these compliance certifications. So it's a similar pitch. You go to the CTO and be like, hey, can I come in and give you a roadmap to how to get SOC 2 compliant? And they're like, yeah, because I need that and I don't know what it is and I'm just punting it off. And then you're like, okay, but I'm going to need to talk to your engineers. And they're like, cool, great. Who do you need when? And you're like, ooh, interesting, different reaction.
Great.
Right?
They're willing to give you access to their engineering team, which is like pretty much the most walled garden resource. And was that because that was a business priority for them? Like they can't sell their software without this, their customers are asking for it. Was that new at the time? I'm assuming this is maybe 2018 that like companies are saying, I know you are a small startup, but you still need to be SOC 2 for me to work with you. Like when did that start happening?
Yes. So 2017, 2018. So this is 2017. Startups did not get SOC 2. When we raised Vanta's seed round in 2018, we'd pitch seed stage VCs and we'd be like, hey, we're SOC 2 all your startups. And the seed stage VCs would turn around and be like, but none of our startups have SOC 2s. Which is very different now in 2022. But this is before that time. We can talk about that shift. But it was a business priority, and this was like an unlock. It was compliance in its best case to me is how you're demonstrating the security you have to grow your business, to bring on larger customers, to open up new markets, healthcare, enterprise, etc. And so there's actually a very strong revenue tie to this, right? And if you think about it as demonstrating your security, you should be demonstrating security you have, not security you don't have. And so there's this neat incentive alignment, back to that point, of, hey, in order to get compliant, you need to work on your internal security. But once you have that internal security, you can go demonstrate it and have a SOC 2 or an ISO 2701, GDPR, whatever. And by the way, that opens up lots of new revenue and new markets for you. So this is worth prioritizing. And that pitch was like very clean, and we figured that out. That unlocked a lot.
Got it. And how did you then think about what people call like time to value, which is okay, someone has said, yes, SOC 2 compliant, like that's on my product roadmap. I need to get that done
Yeah.
for the business. How do you get them from nothing to, oh my God, Vanta's already adding value to us? What was that kind of first aha moment for the product, and how did you guys approach building it?
Yeah, so in terms of just broadly building the product, so again, the first SOC 2 gap assessments were in spreadsheets. We did one, and it was testing of, do we know what we're doing? Do they think we know what we're doing?
Right.
We then did a second one, which was basically take the first, but give it to a second company and change some details, but be like, hey, can we give the first company thing to the second company, and does that work?
Right.
Because we want to standardize this, right? We want to build software for that, not make spreadsheets for everyone, or different spreadsheets for everyone. And so so then the first version of the product was in fact just coding our spreadsheet. It was a list of things you needed to do and whether or not your company was doing them. That was it. It was extraordinarily simple, but it had one job, and that was the one job. And so in terms of time to value is interesting. I don't know what answer, probably would have given you a very complicated answer a couple of years ago around timelines and getting compliance or whatever. I think what actually ended up happening was companies would sign up for Vanta, connect, give us access, read access to an AWS or GitHub or a G Suite, like the tools you're using. And then they would just have this color-coded roadmap of all these things they were doing and all these things they needed to. And there was like an aha moment, because it took this thing of, I need to get SOC 2 compliant. What does that even mean? I need to go do a big research project, pay expensive people, into a color-coded task list.
Got it. Ironically, not that different from that checklist idea you had at first, but now it's packaged into, here's why you are doing it, here's specific information for you to act on that is already taking your context into account because you gave us access to your Google Workspace or whatever.
Correct. Yeah.
Perfect. Got it. Awesome. All right. That is so different from, I think, like outside in what I would have perceived as Vanta's journey. So thank you so much for sharing that. So maybe segueing a little bit into kind of the customer profile, the addressable market. It sounds like your beachhead customers were startups. Can you share a little bit more about that? Who were you usually talking to? Was it usually a founder, CXO, like CTO? And how did you think about building a product for startups versus building a product for like large businesses? Was there, did you think about making choices differently? Was there pressure to try to go up market and solve this for bigger teams, or not really at all?
Yeah, so in the very early days, certainly a bias towards startups because they're like people we knew, people we liked, like spending time with people. But I think there's also a pragmatism. They were people we could talk to, like within a week. I send an email within a week or so. And you could almost like literally get them on iMessage and get feedback right over that. And so it was a broadly predisposition for startups, but we went and talked to everyone. I went and talked to big enterprises, and there was a pragmatism around startup founders because it's just easier to access and easier to get product feedback, and operating under the assumption that when you're building an MVP and trying to actually figure out if it is in fact an MVP versus not, you just want to optimize for feedback. And that is just like the oxygen in the system. And if you do not have customer feedback, it will not work. And so there's like a strong pragmatism in it too.
Got it. And when did you start thinking about, okay, what is our scalable go-to-market strategy? Was this 2018 or later? Like, when did you start thinking, all right, I'm the one reaching out to all our prospective customers right now. What does our go-to-market model actually look like? And what were some of the early evolution around that?
Yeah, so we first went to market in 2018. I sold the first $500,000 of Vanta, and I did that because I was just talking to customers all day long, and I sold like a product person, and there was good and bad of that. The good was just like extreme curiosity and being like, oh, why are you interested in this? Like, what's like, it does this like strong discovery, to use sales terms, right? It was like just super curious of the companies because it was all product feedback. The bad of it was I'd like be like, go a little overboard on discovery, or be like, oh, and I want to show you all the cool features I built, which is like not the makings of a good demo. Sometimes we just like not send people contracts. So good and bad of it. But I did all of that. I tried to do it until it felt repeatable. And the felt repeatable was it was almost boring to do. And that you're like, oh, it's another call, 30 minutes. Okay, I'll like turn half my brain off and just say and do things for 30 minutes and probably send a contract at the end. And it's boring now. And so it was like that point where it felt repeatable, but it didn't feel repeatable to me. It felt boring. It's like the lived experience.
Two follow-up questions. One, like how many calls do you think you did to get to that? How many customer calls do you think you did to get to the 500K? And what was the call script like at a high level? What was the 30-second version?
Yeah, so I'm guessing, but I don't know, somewhere between 100, 150 customers, probably 150, 200, maybe 100, 150. The call script, it's funny. So initially it was first call, it was like a call basically, like no screen share. And I would tell them about, do all this discovery. I didn't know the word discovery, but I would do all this discovery and then tell them about Vanta. And at the end, and then it would end and then being like, that sounds really good. It sounds so good. I think it's snake oil. I don't believe you, basically. You seem very nice, but I do not believe you. And so I'd be like, oh, let me show you. And so the second call was a screen share, and it was this like 30-minute demo, and I had some flow to that. And then one founder was like, I didn't believe you on the first call, and now I believe you after the demo, but you should have just done, like, you don't need 2 calls for this. And it was just like, oh, you are so right. I'm sorry. Thank you for the feedback. Moment. Anyway, and I would try to just do these 30-minute calls, and then because I didn't really know what a next step. I didn't really know how to sell. And what I would do is just be like, oh, do you want a trial? And generally people would say yes. And I read a blog post that said 14-day trials and 30-day trials are the same. So I was like, cool, just have access to Vanta for 14 days. And I may or may not email you during that, depending on what else I'm doing. I should have. May or may not have happened. And then at the end, the next Friday, I would just email them and be like, so could I have your credit card? And people would be like, generally they'd say sure. Which I learned is a presumptive close, but again, did not know any of these words. So it was just like someone bumbling around, but like bumbling around in response to feedback. And it felt like it was like getting close to something. And when I was probably 250, 300K in revenue, I went and talked to a bunch of salespeople and sales advisors and was like, here's what I'm doing. What do you think? And people were generally like, whoa. Some of this makes a lot of sense and some of it's totally bumbly, but it seems like it's working. And by the way, here's phrases like qualification and presumptive close, like all of these things. I'm reading the sales books, but
right. Just explain to you what
totally.
you were doing.
Yeah, and then you're like, oh, those are interesting. I'll Google those words.
Yeah. I mean, what happened in that 14-day window in your customers? You probably now know a lot more about that than you knew at the time. But what usually happened in those 14 days? Because a lot of this also goes back to like actually having to work with an auditor, which I assume probably takes longer. So could you help us understand like what your customers' 2-week or 4-week journey looked like at the time?
Yeah, so we had this in some ways well instrumented, in some ways not. So what we actually did, and I've done this in previous things I built and just found it really helpful, it does not scale at all, but basically built something where whenever someone rebuilt analytics, but in a bad way. Whenever someone took an action in Vanta, you connect a new system, you generate a policy, you like fix a test, we'd send ourselves an email. And so I just had this email log of like all these actions people took. And so that was actually really helpful because you could be like, oh, this person just logged in and they did some stuff. And then again, if I was on my game, I'd like get all these emails and then I'd email them and be like, hey, what do you think of it? And they'd be like, how did you know? And so there was like a little bit, I had like some sense of who was poking around, who wasn't, what were they doing through our email bot, basically, which was really helpful. Again, if you actually do get users and customers, it doesn't scale very well, but it was really helpful in the early days. And what they were generally doing was like getting ready. And the whole Vanta pitch was like, you have this prescriptive to-do list and things are red and green. And if you make everything green, you'll be ready for an audit. So just step one, make everything green. And then step two will get you an auditor and we'll go through that. And so it was really just like working through that task list.
Got it. And so even in the early days, you also doing kind of the auditor marketplace here connect to that was a part of the value prop as well.
It was because we really wanted to get folks SOC 2 compliant, and we were not an auditor and we were not about to become one for regulatory
Right.
reasons. But you need an auditor to get SOC 2 compliant. And so the initial bit was me going out and talking to auditors and trying to get one of them to work with us. And there was some trial and error in that for sure. But eventually it was like what was actually just compelling was it was a smaller firm, it was a more entrepreneurial partner. It was one who actually was very, and I learned this later, that firm was structured such that partners got basically commission on the audits they did. So this person was like personally and financially incented to
Right.
bringing in more business to the firm, not just as a share of partner revenue, but as a specific like kind of W-2 measure, which I learned later. But it was one of those where you're like, oh, that's why you bet on me. That makes sense. Incentives. Anyway, and so just found this person, had a few customers, and okay, can you audit them? And by the way, I will fly to your office in Colorado and sit with you and basically sit with the login to the Vanta database and pull whatever information you need. Because I don't quite know what you need and you don't know how to explain it either. And so let's just sit in your office for a week straight and go through whatever it is you need in order to feel comfortable that this customer is in fact meeting the SOC 2 controls.
Got it. And it's such a valuable thing you're doing because I can't imagine anything a CTO wants to do less than have to call some
Right.
auditors to try to find one for their SOC 2 audit. So
Correct. Yes.
incredibly valuable,
Yes.
especially when you know you can scale it in the future. Awesome. All right. So you've sold 500 of contracts. How did you think about, okay, what's the go to market model? Are we doing bottom up, top down, like a product led, like all the buzzwords? And then,
Yeah.
and who were the first few kind of key hires you made, especially given that you hadn't gone big on raising a lot of money early and were thinking about building this company so frugally?
Yeah. So on go to market motion, so I think always honestly wanted to be product led, but there was just so much product to build that and the like sale someone being a salesperson, me a sales hire, worked well enough that we were just building, we are basically completing the product. And so what we ended up with was like a sales touch, sales assist model where someone, I mean, to this day, go to Vanta.com, the CTAs get a demo, and an AE will take you from demo to close in under a month. And that's always been true. And it is in some ways, again, more pragmatism than philosophical. And the pragmatism was just like, we have so much to build in order to get a company baseline secure, get them ready for SOC 2, get the auditor what they need. And this sales thing seems to be working well enough that we should just make sure we have a complete product first.
Makes sense. And I know that a lot of, especially my investor colleagues, get very nervous when they see a low five-figure ACV product being sold by AEs as opposed to having kind of a self-serve sign-up flow. How did you think about that? How did you think about like did that concern come up for you from your stakeholders, from your board at any point? And how did you think about what is the sales model that can still work with that price point?
Yeah, so it did come up, honestly, when VCs would mention that when we were pitching or like coffee chats or whatever, it seemed very philosophical. Thank you for the feedback. I'm trying to get to 100K in a year, or let me try to figure that out first, right? Before trying to like change it. And it's what I'm doing seems like it's maybe working, but it's not clearly not working. So I hear you. At some point, what I'm doing might not work for those reasons, but this feels more philosophical than my blocker today, this month, this quarter. So it's a little bit of thank you for the feedback. I shall keep that in mind moment. I think where the rubber really meets the road on stuff like that, or what people are, I think the advice is often, oh, you can't sell low five-figure ACVs as a salesperson. And that's the more nuanced version is hey, there are industry standard and best in class sales efficiency metrics. And most companies at the ACV don't get the sales efficiency metrics. So watch out.
Right.
Which is very different. And when you cut, sort of get that, but when you cut Vanta's sales efficiency metrics, they were best in class. And so then we stopped getting it, that critique, because it was like, oh, you've somehow figured out how to make AE average quota attainment 150%. We're not quite sure what you're doing over there, probably hiring too few AEs, honestly, but clearly there's something there.
Got it. So what does rep productivity at Vanta look like? What does a good rep do in, say, a month or however you track it? Like, how many customers do they close in a month or a quarter?
Yeah, it's funny. So we have not changed a lot of this, even back to 2019, the first sales rep. So a couple things. One, we have monthly quotas. We still have monthly quotas. When I was selling, I gave myself weekly quotas. Mm-hmm. Basically, people convinced me I could not hire anyone on a weekly quota. And even to this day that we hire on monthly is still surprising to folks. But to me, it's a less than 30-day sales cycle, so it's a monthly quota. And if you give people a quarterly quota, the sales cycle will almost certainly extend incentives. So that's really important. Original quota, which again, we still have, was based on what I was selling. So I was selling about 3 deals a week, 12 deals a month. And so my thinking was, I have all the benefits of being a founder of the company and having built the product and know it super well, but I'm also like not a very good salesperson. And so if we bring in a good salesperson who is not a founder, then doesn't know the product as well or has to learn it, let's just say these things cancel out.
Right.
And so can you do what I was doing? And it was like, ugh. And we brought in a very good salesperson and they blew it out of the water. They did like twice what I did, which was awesome. Right?
Humbling and great.
Totally. I thought I was getting good. I wasn't. Cool. Great. Glad you're here. But anyway, that's how I figured out initial quota. I was like, I don't know. Can you do what I was doing? We'll see. And the answer was like, definitely yes.
Got it. Makes sense. And if you think about Vanta's future versus what you're doing now, I'm curious, are you thinking about continuing to stay focused on the startup segment? Or have you thought about, is there a compelling reason to go up market and at what point? Like, how are you now thinking about future product strategy?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, the startup market is our roots, philosophical alignment is and will always be extraordinarily important. And I think there's like a hearts and minds, there's revenue and customer account piece, but there's like a hearts and minds piece there that I do not want to ever lose. That said, Vanta is a very special company in lots of ways, but it's also not a special company in other ways. And like one way it's not is like kind of everyone in B moves up market over time.
Right.
And so we probably will too, right? And that's just like a little bit of like a law of physics sort of thing. And we see that, right? When you serve startups, some of them grow and then they get more demanding as customers. And I say it's like the best way of being demanding, but like totally more demanding. And so you also just get this pull from them. And so our approach historically has been build for those demanding early customers who are bought into the vision, but maybe now are frustrated with the product and its limitations. But if you can get them in a good spot again, you should also be able to go out and get new folks, right? But again, these folks that are already bought into the premise, you're just annoying them, just stop annoying them, which is quite hard and requires a lot of product effort, but that as the first step.
So you're finding product market fit again with this new segment, but you have the benefit of the fact that some of your existing customers have already moved into that segment. So hopefully they can drag you along with them.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Christina, one of the things we have noticed is great CEOs almost end up having to become new types of leaders every 6 months. That's what makes the role so challenging, as your company is often growing faster than you can evolve as a leader, need something different from you all the time. How do you invest in your own evolution as a leader and a CEO?
Yeah, I think one thing that helped in the early days, because the early days when you also haven't hired folks, is again, you're sales until you hire a salesperson, and you've got to hire a good one. Like you're support until you hire a support person, customer success, right? And for me, I had this kind of product and technical background, but I didn't know go-to-market at all. And I just felt like I was constantly bad at all my jobs, which I was. Ooh, this is the point, because I am learning these jobs. And if I ever feel like I'm good at them, that means I should be hiring someone for it. right? Like for the next couple of years, my job is to do a bunch of jobs I've never done and feel bad at them until I feel better at them such that I can find someone. And I think that like mental shift was like a big deal for me because it was, oh, cool, it's just going to feel like failure for a while, but hopefully it's not, right? Versus day in and day out being like, why am I not a better salesperson? Being like, my job is to get better at sales. When you do something new, especially as someone who like likes to feel like they know what they're doing, you definitely don't. And so that feels uncomfortable. But again, normalizing that for myself was like a big deal. That was just in the early days, actually really helpful.
Makes sense. Are there any specific mentors or books or anything that stand out to you as something that, like looking back, was the right advice that you got at the right time?
Yeah, a couple things. I read all the startup management books and the management books and engineering management books, and I actually think they're very helpful, but also like I don't know, you read them all, and I think it's better than not. But so much of this stuff is practical learning. You do like, how do you learn to manage people? You have to manage people poorly and do it better. And it kills me deeply that you have to practice on other people because that just seems so unfair. And I don't know way around it, but it just makes me cringe to this day. Thinking about doing it now, thinking about having done it. It's like brutal. I think there's also been a handful of folks that have just been extraordinarily helpful. One in particular, J. Zach Stein, he's on Vanta's board now, but met him in 2018 when I sold Vanta to him, and he just negotiated me under the table. And I felt great about it at the end. He was someone who would negotiate you under the table, and then you're like, oh, this was such a pleasant interaction. And he foolishly at the end of that offered to stay in touch, and I became this gnat at his side, and 2.5 years later it's still there. And it was just really helpful because one, he'd seen more scale. He got a company that was a year to 2 years ahead of Vanta and was close enough but knew it, the COO of that company, and so had led all the other functions. And when I'm trying to figure out what the heck RevOps is, and then it was also like his strengths are very different. And again, his strength, I think he has many strengths, but one of them was just interpersonal management. Again, he's the person who can negotiate under the table or let you go and you feel great about everything. And I so wanted that and did not have it. That was just really helpful.
Makes sense. So I know you have a one-on-one coming up in case our listeners want to know more about the amazing lifestyle CEOs lead just before and after they do podcast recordings. Any last words of kind of parting advice for founders starting up right now? Someone who's considering starting a company, what would be your top few points of advice?
Yeah, okay, a couple things. One, so recording in 2022, obviously macro environment in 2022, much different than 2021. I actually like this environment much more. I like the focus on sustainable growth and like building a business. It's harder in some ways, but I think it just forces a lot of clarity that the company has to adapt at some point, and it's just so much easier if you build it in early. So I think for folks who are like, the economy crashing, maybe, and actually I do buy into that, and that's a great time to start a company, because the things that are harder now, companies have to go through in general, and it's harder there to go through when you're small. It's even harder to go through when you have 1,000 people. So I just do think that is a big advantage. I think the other part, especially in this environment, but even in last year's, one of the quote unquote tricks I learned when I was in VC was that the best way to have a bunch of venture capitalists want to fund your company is to not need venture capitalists to fund your company, right? Venture capitalists want to fund businesses that don't need them more than businesses that do in order to stay in business. And from Vanta, we did a bunch of things early on to build our own conviction in the business and build a business that we always wanted to be venture funded and huge, but we didn't take venture money for a while. And we got to $10 million in ARR on the $3 million seed round. And again, that wasn't a bootstrap to venture pivot. It was just can we build a real proper business? And then the funding will take care of itself. And very biased on that one because that's what we did. But I do think it gave us a lot of freedom and control later on. And at the time forced us to build conviction in the business ourselves versus outsourcing that and being like, oh, we're doing a good job because this VC says we're doing a good job. It's like, no, we're doing a good job because we're doing a good job. And here's how we know that.
Amazing. I feel like we could just keep talking for hours, but I will let you get back to your extremely busy day building Vanta. So impressed by what you've built here, and will be waiting to see where you take Vanta in the future. Thank you so much for spending time with us, Christina.
Thank you so much for having me.